Welcome back, you silent strategists, you masters of observation wrapped in patience, you calculated operators who've been studying, analyzing, recording every single breath they took while they believed you were asleep. Welcome back to the reckoning that shifted everything. The moment when 3 quiet syllables became an atomic bomb. The instant when you uttered the phrase, and their carefully constructed reality disintegrated. Did you catch it? Did you witness the blood drain from their face like someone severed their connection to life itself? Did you observe their pupils dilate with that ancient recognition, that primitive horror of being exposed, unmasked, revealed for precisely what they are? Because that's exactly what transpired, isn't it? You didn't elevate your tone. You didn't shout or hurl objects or press for justification. You simply gazed at them with those eyes that have witnessed too much, endured too much, comprehended too much, and you delivered those syllables that carried the gravity of 1,000 restless nights. And in that instant, their armor crumbled like porcelain meeting pavement at free-fall speed. Let's explore that instant, that magnificent, devastating, permanent instant when they discovered you weren't the idiot they assumed you were. They had you labeled, didn't they? They had you archived under gullible and unsuspecting, and will never understand. They constructed their entire operation around the belief that you would remain sightless, remain clueless, remain perfectly unaware while they conducted their business in the darkness. They grinned in your presence while scheming behind your shoulders. They communicated in cipher. They assumed you couldn't decipher. They scattered clues they believed you'd never pursue. They miscalculated the single element they should have respected most, which is your stillness, your restraint, your capacity to recognize sequences where others notice accidents. You weren't bewildered. You were accumulating evidence. You weren't blind. You were constructing a prosecution. You weren't believing. You were experimenting. And every single experiment they failed miserably while celebrating how brilliantly they were deceiving you. Here's what they never grasped about individuals like you. The survivors who emerge from treachery even more lethal. You don't respond instantly because you're analyzing, strategizing, confirming before you execute, because you understand that reality is an instrument that only functions once. And when you deploy it, it must be fatal. So you observed them fabricate about their whereabouts and you remained silent. You registered the contradictions in their narratives and you grinned. You discovered the communications they assumed they erased, and you maintained your expression blank. You absorbed them reference information they couldn't possess, and you archived it internally. Every fabrication became another fragment of proof. Every deception, another notation in the psychological record you were compiling. And they had zero awareness that beneath your tranquil surface, you were assembling a prosecution so flawless that when you eventually chose to articulate, there would be no exit, no justifications, no method to manipulate their escape from the reality because you weren't planning to offer them an opportunity to rationalize. You were planning to offer them a reflection, and then arrive that instant, that millisecond, that will plague them for the remainder of their miserable existence. They were mid-statement, likely spinning another complex fabrication, likely adding another tier to their monument of deception, likely feeling extraordinarily satisfied with themselves for sustaining the illusion. And that's when you executed it. You didn't disrupt theatrically. You didn't strike your palm on the surface. You simply anticipated that flawless pause, that microscopic opening in their act, and you regarded them with eyes that had abandoned pretending weeks earlier, and you delivered it with a composure that was more horrifying than any shriek could ever achieve. You declared, "I know," and observed the vitality extinguish in their gaze. It wasn't instantaneous. No, it was like witnessing a computer malfunction in decelerated motion. First, the bewilderment as their consciousness attempted to interpret what you just articulated, then the computation as they attempted to determine what precisely you understood, then the dread as they comprehended you understood everything, and finally, the disintegration, as they recognized that every syllable they were preparing to vocalize would be worthless because the judgment was concluded and they had already been convicted. Did you witness their jaw separate and seal like a creature suffocating an atmosphere? Did you observe them scramble cognitively, attempting to locate a reply that would succeed, a diversion that would connect, a reversal that would relocate the attention? But nothing materialized. Because how do you reply to someone who just informed you they've been multiple moves ahead of you this complete duration? How do you deceive someone who's already witnessed the reality? How do you control someone who's been examining your control methodologies like an academic dissertation? You cannot. And they understood it. And that's why their essence abandoned their physical form right there before you. The individual you were addressing vanished, and what persisted was just an empty vessel attempting frantically to recall how to inhale, how to reason, how to function in a reality where they were no longer the intelligent one, no longer the one commanding, no longer the orchestrator, but the marionette who just realized their cables were being controlled by someone else the entire duration. And that someone was you sitting there with limitless composure and that faint expression that communicated, "I've been anticipating this instant." You understand what the most exquisite component was? The quietness that ensued. That dense, asphyxiating quietness where they realized that anything they vocalized would only excavate their tomb deeper. They desired to inquire, "What do you understand?" But they were petrified of the response. They desired to reject everything, but they didn't comprehend what everything encompassed. They desired to redirect it toward you, but they possessed no weapons remaining because you hadn't provided them anything to utilize against you. You had been so meticulous, so tactical, so impossibly disciplined while they were negligent, arrogant, reckless in their duplicity because they authentically believed you were too elementary to penetrate their exhibition. And now here they existed, standing in the devastation of their own hubris. Observing, you observe them with the type of serenity that originates from understanding you possess every single advantage. And there's nothing, absolutely nothing they can execute to modify the conclusion because it was determined the instant you determined to cease pretending you didn't understand. Let's excavate deeper into what you actually understood, shall we? Because I know wasn't just regarding one deception, was it? It was regarding the configuration, the complete, elaborate network they had been constructing, assuming you couldn't perceive the connections. You understood about the dialogues they conducted behind your position, the ones where they examined your vulnerabilities and ridiculed your faith. You understood about the strategies they formulated, the partnerships they established, the alternatives they arranged for the occasion you might eventually discover. You understood about the additional individuals participating, the collaborators, the observers, the ones who understood what was transpiring and communicated nothing because they were too spineless or too involved to alert you. You understood about the chronology. You could diagram precisely when the betrayal commenced, when it intensified, when they became comfortable enough to cease concealing their traces as thoroughly. You understood about their incentives, the inadequacies and envies and trivial resentments that motivated them to penetrate you in the posterior while grasping your palm. And you understood something they didn't, which is that information isn't just authority, it's patience militarized. And you had been patient for such duration that when you eventually attacked, it wasn't an assault, it was an elimination. Here's what transpires in their consciousness during those initial seconds after you detonated that explosive on them. Their brain activates emergency procedure, examining through every exchange you've experienced recently, attempting to identify precisely when you determined it out, how substantial you actually understand versus how substantial you're pretending, whether there's any conceivable method to rescue the circumstance, or if they need to immediately transition into crisis management orientation. They're executing calculations more rapidly than any machine, evaluating their alternatives, which are all catastrophic, contemplating their replies, which are all insufficient, attempting to locate some perspective, some advantage, some method to manipulate this back in their benefit. But there isn't one, because you didn't provide them one. You anticipated until you possessed everything, until every conceivable escape passage was blocked, until there was nowhere to flee and nowhere to conceal. And only then did you disclose that you understood. And by disclose, I mean you simply acknowledged what you'd understood for weeks or months while they assumed they were escaping with it. And that's what makes it so obliterating. Not that you discovered, but that you understood. And permitted them keep progressing. Permitted them bury themselves deeper. Permitted them accumulate more deceptions to the collection until the mass of their own duplicity demolished them. And now we arrive at the instant of reality, the fraction of a second where they must determine how to reply. And let's scrutinize their alternatives, shall we? Alternative one is to reject everything, to regard at you with manufactured bewilderment and articulate, "Know what?" as if performing ignorant will somehow restart the dialogue and provide them duration to reason. But that doesn't function because your expression informs them you're concluded with the performances. You're not here to be manipulated. You're not here to be controlled. You're here to observe them contort in the reality they fabricated. Alternative two is to acknowledge to something minimal, to provide you a fractional reality and expectations that you'll assume that's all there exists. The traditional restricted revelation where they admit to a minor violation, expecting it will fulfill your requirement for honesty, while the larger deceptions remain concealed. But they can perceive in your eyes that you're not purchasing partial realities. You desire the complete inventory. You desire everything, and anything inferior than absolute honesty is just another offense to your intellect, which they've already offended sufficiently. Alternative three is to assault, to reverse the narrative and make you the antagonist for investigating or not believing or being suspicious, to transform your justified information into your personality defect. But that's a frantic maneuver, and they understand it won't function because you're too composed, too balanced, too clearly in authority of this circumstance to surrender for such transparent control. So they stand there, or sit there, or recline there, against whatever surface is maintaining them vertical, and they cycle through these alternatives in microseconds while their essence continues its departure from their physical form. You can perceive it transpiring, can't you? The method their stance transforms from assured to protective. The method their voice that was so fluid instants ago now fractures and falters. The method their hands commence moving anxiously because their physical form needs to execute something while their consciousness is occupied imploding. They might laugh. That terrible hollow laugh individuals make when they're attempting to act like something serious is actually absurd. They might shake their head like you're being ridiculous. They might even attempt to contact you, extend with a hand that you regard at with such frigid separation that it freezes midair and withdraws. And through all of this, through every unsuccessful strategy and deserted tactic, you just sit there with those syllables hanging in the atmosphere like a guillotine blade. And your silence communicates everything their panic cannot, which is that the judgment is concluded, the verdict is delivered. And the punishment is whatever you determine it to exist, because you're the one possessing all the authority. Now, let's discuss what those syllables actually represent. Because I know isn't just a declaration of fact, it's a proclamation of conflict won without a confrontation fought. It's you informing them that every control they attempted failed. Every deception they communicated was transparent. Every maneuver they executed was foreseeable. It's you disclosing that while they assumed they were the participant, you were the one composing the competition, and the complete duration they were exhibiting for an audience that perceived through every single scene. It's the sound of their superiority complex fracturing, the instant when the individual who assumed they were so intelligent, so polished, so exceptional at duplicity, realizes they were being permitted to excavate their own tomb, and the individual possessing the instrument was you the entire duration. I know is the most efficient method to obliterate someone who's constructed their complete strategy on your ignorance, because it demonstrates that the foundation they were standing on never existed. They were constructing fortresses in the atmosphere, and you just disclosed that you could perceive they were levitating on deceptions this complete duration. And now you're concluded pretending gravity doesn't exist. Here's what makes this instant so absolutely flawless, so dramatically exquisite that if existence were a film, this would be the scene that wins recognition. It's not regarding vengeance, not genuinely, because vengeance implies you're on their level, participating their competition, permitting them affect you sufficiently to make you react emotionally. No, this is something more refined than vengeance. This is justice served frigid by someone who refused to descend to their level, who selected instead to ascend so far beyond their insignificant duplicities that you could perceive the complete landscape of their deceptions from a perspective they couldn't imagine. You didn't descend. You didn't plot. You didn't devise elaborate countermaneuvers. You simply observed, recalled, confirmed, and then when the instant was flawless, you articulated syllables that contained complete paragraphs of proof they don't even understand you possess. And the magnificence of it is that they'll never understand the complete extent of what you discovered. They'll spend the remainder of their existence wondering how substantial you actually understood. What you selected not to articulate, what you determined wasn't even worth mentioning because it was so pathetic compared to everything else. And now we need to address what transpires after. Because I know isn't the conclusion of the narrative. It's the commencement of their torment. They're going to replay this instant 10,000 times in their head, analyzing every syllable they articulated, every maneuver they executed, attempting to determine where they miscalculated when you commenced suspecting, how they could have been more cautious. They're going to lose sleep wondering if you informed anyone else, if there are others who understand what they executed, if their reputation is being demolished behind closed doors while they smile and pretend everything is acceptable. They're going to perceive you differently now, not as the individual they deceived, but as the individual who deceived them into assuming they were deceiving you, which is a level of psychological combat they didn't understand existed. Every time they perceive you after this, even if you never articulate about it again, they'll recall this instant. They'll recall the method their stomach descended when you articulated those syllables. They'll recall the sensation of their essence evacuating their physical form in real time. And they'll understand that you understand, and they'll understand that you'll always understand. And that information will consume at them like acid in their consciousness eternally. You desire to understand the authentic reason those syllables had such devastating impact, because they disclose something horrifying about you, something they had catastrophically failed to comprehend. They assumed your kindness was weakness, your faith was stupidity, your patience was ignorance. But in that instant, When you regarded at them with those eyes that have perceived through every mask they've ever worn, they realize the reality, which is that you're dangerous. Not in the loud, aggressive method that's easy to defend against, but in the quiet, observant method that dismantles individuals without ever elevating a voice. You're the type of dangerous that doesn't announce itself, doesn't make threats, doesn't need to prove anything because it understands what it understands, and that's sufficient. You're dangerous because you can sit across from someone deceiving to your face and smile while cataloging every tell, every inconsistency, every mistake they make because they're so confident you won't notice. You're dangerous because you comprehend that information is only powerful when the other individual doesn't understand you possess it, and you possess the discipline to sit on that information until the flawless instant, which is a level of strategic reasoning they will never possess. Let's examine the ripple effects of this instant, because when you obliterate someone's illusion of authority with syllables, the shockwave extends far beyond just that dialogue. Suddenly, they're questioning everything. Every individual they've controlled, every deception they've communicated, every scheme they've executed, wondering if everyone else understands too, if they've been walking around like an emperor with no garments while everyone silently judges them. Their confidence, which was always fragile and constructed on the assumption that they were more intelligent than everyone else, completely disintegrates. Because if you determine them out, who else has? If you were pretending not to understand, who else is pretending? If you've been multiple steps ahead of them, how many others are even further ahead? Their complete worldview must reorganize around this new information that they're not the intelligent manipulator they assumed they were. They're the transparent amateur everyone's been observing and pitying. And that realization doesn't just wound their pride, it fundamentally alters their sense of identity. Because if you're not the individual you assumed you were, then who are you? And here's the component they'll never recover from. The wound that won't heal, no matter how substantial duration passes or how substantial they attempt to rationalize it away. They understand now that there was a period of duration, days or weeks or months, when you understood the reality and didn't articulate anything, when you regarded at them and understood they were deceiving and smiled anyway, when you permitted them continue their exhibition knowing it was an exhibition. That gap between when you understood and when you informed them you understood, that's the space where their ego goes to perish. Because it means that during all those exchanges where they assumed they were in authority, you were the one in authority. Every dialogue you experienced after you determined it out, you were the director and they were the actor who didn't understand they were being filmed. And now they must go back through all those memories and perceive them from this new perspective, where they're not the manipulator, they're the entertainment. And you were observing them like someone observes a tragedy unfold, with that combination of fascination and pity that originates from knowing how it concludes, while the characters on stage remain blissfully unaware. Now let's discuss about the authority dynamic shift that just occurred. Because before you articulated those syllables, they assumed they possessed leverage over you. They assumed they were escaping with something which provided them a sense of superiority, a secret thrill, a sensation of being intelligent and untouchable. But the instant you disclosed that you understood, every bit of leverage they assumed they possessed evaporated instantly. And not only that, they realized you possessed leverage over them this complete duration and selected not to utilize it, which is a level of authority they can't comprehend. You possess their secret, their reality, their exposure in your hands, and determined when to disclose it, if to disclose it, how to disclose it. And that makes you the authority in this dynamic, the one who controls the narrative, the one who determines what transpires next. They're now in a position where they must anticipate for your maneuver, react to your determinations, expect that you'll be merciful, and that complete reversal of authority transpired in the span of syllables, which is the most efficient coup in the history of interpersonal combat. And here's what makes you truly horrifying to them now, what will maintain them up at night long after this instant fades into painful memory. They're realizing that if you could conceal your information this well, if you could exhibit ignorance so convincingly, if you could sustain such flawless composure while understanding what you understood, then what else are you capable of? What other secrets might you be maintaining? What other observations have you executed that you haven't shared? What other competitions are you participating that they can't perceive? Suddenly, you're not the elementary, straightforward individual they assumed they had determined out. You're an unknown variable, a mystery, a potential threat that they can no longer calculate or predict. And that uncertainty, that inability to understand what you're reasoning or what you might execute next, is more destabilizing than any threat you could make, because threats inform individuals where the danger exists. But this just informs them that danger exists somewhere in your capabilities and they possess no idea where or when it might manifest.